Mr. Manuel, you are known as a favorite political son of Papatina Sisulu and Walter Sisulu. Why do you think that is so?
Well, I can't speak for other people. I got to know the political leadership early. That was a great privilege. When we launched the UDF in '83, the relationship with Masisulu took off. I mean, in the build-up to the launch, I visited her at home. Apart from Zwelakhe, the other children were in exile. She took a big liking to me, and then over the years I think we established a very warm relationship, so that I was in government for a long time already, and I thought I was just old and haggard, and she still referred to me as my baby. And I think Uncle Walter, when he was released, in fact, I was in prison during that period, but we connected very soon thereafter. And we also built a relationship. And I think that in his case, he was such a remarkable leader. He had to be watched and learned from. His influence over Madiba, for instance, was so phenomenal. And he was always seen as the elder statesman amongst the group of Rivonia trialists, and therefore that rubbed off onto the ANC more generally. And I think it was just a great privilege to learn at his feet. He was quite remarkable because he was calm, very comfortable in who he was and what he needed to do, and not focused on position. He knew that his influence didn't depend on occupying any particular position.
What was the significance of Walter and Albertina Sisulu's influence on your role and responsibilities as an activist, and also a person within the negotiations?
Soon after the unbanning, there were all kinds of stresses and strains. Amongst them was the position of Madiba himself. And I think that Uncle Walter was very clear about the need to ensure that Madiba became a figurehead of their generation. And he would persuade other people about that responsibility. And there were other people pushing back against it. I remember one of the people who tried to push back against that was Harry Gwala in KZN, the Midlands. And Harry was a militant who couldn't be tamed, and there was one occasion where Madiba went to KZN, addressed a rally at a place called Taylor's Halt, and called on people to throw their guns and pangas into the sea, and show leadership for peace. And Harry wasn't going to have this. And so he filled a few combis and drove to Johannesburg to come and demand AK-47s. In his own style, he wanted to take on Madiba as well. It was actually Walter who stepped into the breach and said, no. Mtumdala, as they called Harry, we need to deal with this issue differently. This is not Madiba's decision, it's our collective decision. And then calmed it. It was touch and go, because the young people who Harry brought with him from the Natal Midlands had all seen and tasted death, and they wanted revenge, and they didn't quite know the niceties of meeting procedure and discipline. And it took the presence of Uncle Walter to diffuse that situation. So that was one. Another was in relation to the Youth League. One of the much debated positions has been the extent to which the Youth League ought to be subject to the same norms of discipline that the rest of the ANC would be. And there was a bit of a standoff because Peter Mokaba, leading the Youth League, in spite of a request not to do so, led Kill the Farmer, Kill the Boer, a song. And the leadership thought that it's necessary to call in the young people. Madiba was very angry about this. And, but he sat there with Uncle Walter, Joe Slovo, Thomas and Corby, Alfred and Zoe. This is before the 91 conference. I mean, that was the recognizable leadership of all the strands. And the youth leadership were brought in and told to go and issue a statement, explained why the ANC needed to take responsibility for the transformation of all of society, why their conduct was wrong. They apologized in the meeting. They were ordered to go and issue a statement. They issued a statement. They were called back. And Madiba said, let me take you back to the discussion we had before. You had to issue a statement, right? This statement is not the statement we agreed upon. The statement actually says nothing. Now you go and issue a new statement. One that recognizes that you are sorry for what you've done. It was Uncle Walter who kind of put his hand on Madiba's and said, Deebs, it's okay. These boys know. If we push them too hard, they're going to be humiliated in the public space. I think that they understand what we require of them. Do you? And they confirmed that they did. They were all kind of shivering in their boots because they understood that if Madiba had his way right then and they issued a new statement, there'd be nothing left of them in the public domain. So that kind of a calming influence of Walter Sisulu was always there, and I think a major force. I think that also because he didn't seek to occupy high position, he could exercise the influence by virtue of being a leader and not because he occupied position. I think that in many ways that is a missing dimension. If one looks at the events in the ANC, and I think it has had an impact on the country. There were issues around Julius Malema that should have been dealt with hard political education, using the same kinds of lessons, and not via the discipline route. But that was the route chosen. And what you don't have is a body of elders who aren't contesting positions, but who have the experience and the interest, who are tried and tested, and whose presence can be made to be felt in giving effect to a direction which is focused on common purpose in a democracy.
You were an activist against the apartheid state, and then later you were a leader as part of negotiating with the apartheid state. Could you explain the change in role and responsibility?
Look, the objective of taking on the state very clearly was about trying to give effect to the broad objectives of the Freedom Charter. For us, the people shall govern had particular meaning, and if you expanded that clause into the right of people, the right and responsibility of people to vote, the right to have public representatives, all of that was part of what the struggle was about. what was very unclear to us is how it would all end. We all were pretty militant. I think that in some strange way we all had this notion. I'm not quite sure where it came from. Perhaps it was imported from Nicaragua or some such place, of wearing military fatigues and sort of women throwing roses at your feet as you kind of seize the country. It wasn't to be. The one issue was that we tried to remain close to trends in the ANC. And even though we were in prison, the Kabwe Conference in 1985 had articulated very clearly what needed to be done. Beyond that, I think that whilst I was prevented by virtue of house arrest when I was out, we were able to get a lot more movement of activists. There then was a kind of seasoned, albeit not very visible, UDF leadership. Getting into and out of the country, ostensibly going to conferences. So those who could travel, traveled. And if there was a conference, for instance, there was a children's conference convened in Harare. It must have been about 88, 89. Anybody who could travel went there. And the idea wasn't that there was any big interest in children's rights, so that was always part of the struggle. And the issues such as detention of children brought a very sharp focus on this. People went there because it opened channels of communication with the ANC from exile. And those links which were then available in the late 80s after Kabwe, I think brought us in very close a relationship. And one of the things that we needed to do, and it came as a very clear request / instruction, was to start preparing the ground for negotiated transfer of power. There was the Harare Declaration, was adopted by the frontline states. We had the declaration. We had to try and work that declaration. And one of the requests that had been put to us was that we needed to convene a conference of all forces. And so I remember coming out of prison in July of 88, and we wanted this conference to be held in Cape Town for the country, because Cape Town in relative terms was, I mean, the apartheid repressive machinery was less severe than in other parts, so we thought we should have it in Cape Town. And we then started working to convene it somewhere towards the middle of September. And no sooner had we started the work on that than a large number of us were detained. So I was out for 10 weeks between my release in July of 88 and my re-detention in September. And that was around trying to convene a conference of all forces to begin preparing the ground for a set of issues relating to the negotiated transfer of power, because all of the leaders of the frontline states were involved in this matter. So that conference was not possible because too many people had been detained. And ultimately, we were able to convene that conference at Wits towards the end of '89. Right, so we were detained until February of 89, came out, started work. It seemed like the ground was a bit more ready. Later that year, we were able to mount a defiance campaign where we organized people onto the beaches at the Strand and Blouberg Strand in the Western Cape, mobilizing people. And then there was an attempt at the white referendum and tricameral elections. And again, during that period, we were detained. And when we were out, we knew that now we could plain sail. And so how the transfer of power would happen, I think, was a political agreement, certainly within the ranks of the ANC. And what we needed to do was to convince other forces. At the conference, I think it was called Conference for a Democratic Future, which was convened at Wits, almost everybody, all of the parties who were there, so there were fragments of the PAC, fragments of AZAPO, fragments of the UDA, of the Unity Movement and so on. The people who disagreed were AZAPO. And in the afternoon, Srini Moodley was then leading AZAPO, led a walkout of perhaps 20 people or so from the conference. But we were very resolute in going ahead, and we thought that we'd sort of captured a lot of ground. Those issues were very important. You know, if you take that entire strand of negotiations and how it unfolded, because the next set of things that happened related to, by the time we had that conference, Uncle Walter and Uncle Kathy and all of them had been out of prison already. And the next thing that happened was the 2nd of February, when again we were ready. We claimed that as our victory. While the clerk was speaking in Parliament, we were already toying outside of Parliament, claiming the victory. But if you just took that strand of negotiations, at the end of April of 1990, a lot of the ANC leadership were flown into Cape Town for negotiations. And there was a Grooteskuur Minute that was drafted early May of that year. And thereafter, I think it became possible for both the return of exiles and the release of political prisoners. And the ANC took the opportunity to try and normalize the present. The next important meeting was in August of 1990. When there were talks about what was called the cessation of hostilities, and that produced what the record will reflect as something called the Pretoria Minute. One of the big issues about the Pretoria Minute was that as an organization, the ANC wasn't ready. There were people in detention from Vula. There were people who were still in prison. There were many, many people who were still in exile. And there was a view amongst a large section of MK that we couldn't agree to the cessation of hostilities. There were very intense debates and meetings. Eventually, you know, this wasn't even a full NEC. It was NEC members who were here, plus the internal leadership core, agreed on this position. And one of the people arguing against it was Chris Hani. And then there was an agreement. Once the agreement was reached, and this I think is very important in the context of leadership, of discipline, and of executing decisions that you may not start out supporting. It was Chris who had a very high level of respect across all of MK. He was chief of staff. His role was very different to that of Joe Modise, and he had a lot more access to people, partly because of the way in which he'd carried himself. In exile, the particular role that he played when there was an attempted mutiny in Angola, Chris's role was a very, very important role. And was Chris, having been persuaded of the correctness of the decision, who went out and placed himself and people who were still underground at some risk by then asking that militants in the ANC accept a position. Now, that's a historic fact, and I think that Chris's biography will reflect that was a very intense period, and I think in many ways his own leadership skills were tested to the limit, because essentially that moment in the life of Mkhonto Wesizwe is a moment where you transition from an armed struggle to a political struggle. The way in which the ANC had always articulated it was that the means would be political, and that the armed struggle would be embarked upon as a means towards a political objective. But it's okay to say those things. This was the first moment when it was tested in reality. And when I look back at leaders, and I begin to understand the role that Chris had played, the risk, the personal risk that he'd subjected himself to, because there was always the opportunity for pushback. And bear in mind that militants were in the country, all had access to arms caches. But Chris, having built the trust when it was necessary, could harvest that trust and use it to persuade people about the correctness of political decision and hold discipline. You see, if you can't hold discipline, if you merely say whatever comes into your head, then you aren't a leader in the same way. So for me, when I look at that period of the transition from an armed struggle to a more purely political struggle, it was there. It was observing at first hand the conduct of people. It was trying to understand what this meant. It was recognizing what important role a disciplined movement plays in holding people together. That was very important. And so it wasn't about individual decisions. I think it was understanding the value of an organization that embraced you, that you committed to, and that allowed you to be, provided you accepted norms and standards. And within politics, norms and standards are also important. And so on the transition, I think it was that.
Can I check with you that many of you were not angry? Was it because Madiba, Walter Sisulu, Ahmed Kathrada, Govan Mbeki, because they were not angry? That's why you all were not angry at the apartheid state, given the circumstances and the atrocities committed, and Harry Gwala being angry.
Well, you see, I mean, the key issue for me is learning in the process of maturing. Bear in mind that we were of a generation that didn't actually have a previous generation that we could touch. We were growing up as kind of political orphans. who were the big people in our communities who could kind of hand over the skill to us? I mean, sure, there were, when I was coming through, there were people that we were very attached to, in Googs, for instance. Christmas Tinto, Zoli Malindi, Mildred Lesia. They played a very important, formative role. Their role was more of a political role. Oscar Mpeta was a very angry man. He was a bit like Harry in some respects. But we worked with all of them. We learned to distinguish. We learned some of the craft from them. But what that does is, if you are conscious of being an orphan, if you must, you learn to take responsibility early. And so it wasn't just observing the conduct of Rivonia trialists, it was also appreciating that we had a leadership role. And you know, we were, if you look at the Western Cape, I mean, we had to take responsibility for the UDF. We debated intensely some campaigns, because it was about organization building. Organization building also requires stabilizing a base amongst parents, for instance, creating opportunities for support for the youth, creating opportunities for a lot more militants, being able to hold off some people who were a bit crazy, dealing with political education, because I think we also understood that the positions of the ANC were actually a lot harder. If you say to people that your policies include non-racialism, South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, and no government can justly claim authority unless it's based on the will of the people. If you say that to people, it's a lot more difficult than saying, let's throw the whites into the sea. And I think by being part of a movement that took positions that it considered historically correct, there was a maturing for us as well, because you had to guard against people who had easy options. When you look at that period of the mid-80s, the application of strategy and tactics, the ability to work with but isolate people who were a bit more crazy. I mean, there was a man in Bonteheuwel Kalksteenfontein, Putamaili. Putamaili, you know, always believed in the most militant kinds of things. So people are gathered at St. Athens Road Mosque. It would be Putamaili who takes out a gun and fires at the police. And then they go completely ballistic. Putamaili's sons, when they were when they were arrested for shooting a security guard in Belgravia, you know, wanted to involve me in a crazy scheme. He wanted me to smuggle an axe into the court where his sons were appearing, and he wanted to chop off his hand in the court. Now, to me, that wasn't militant, that was just complete craziness. And he was many years my senior. But I was able to distinguish already then and say to him, I wasn't going to do it. I didn't have to find an excuse, you know. I was saying to him, no, I'm not going to do it because it's crazy. If you want to be a soldier, then you need two hands to shoot a gun. What is this, you know? But Amaili was like that. He was completely impulsive. And when you have uprisings, frequently those impulsive people take root, you see. I mean, because it's a lot more attractive to people who can't find a way out. But that is if you only see events. If you learn about political transition, then you know that political sustainability requires many, many different attributes. And, you know, I think we were fortunate. We were exposed at an early age and had to sort of go with those kinds of things, you know.
You're in government, and some of your colleagues that we spoke to considers you as the hardest working minister since in the Mandela cabinet to in particular the last years of Thabo Mbeki, and also managing the establishment of the National Treasury. What did that require from you? And why do they see you as the hardest working minister?
Well, I don't know. I think that in many ways, Ahmed Kathrada makes a point that people look at those who were on the island as always having been in most danger. And he says, we weren't in most danger. It wasn't even the people in exile. It was the people trying to run a mass democratic movement who were always at danger. The responsibilities were different. And I think in many ways our work ethic had to be different. You were trying to build organizations, you were trying to run from the cops, you were trying to stabilize activists, you needed to run political education so that the skills were always replicated. All of these things had to be done in an environment where there wasn't an opportunity for high degrees of specialization. And I think in those circumstances you learn fast, you grow up fast, you take responsibility. It was actually, that entire period was quite amazing in that there was a sense of family. Who did you work with all the time? The same people. And in many ways, you know, for us in the Western Cape, Grassroots wasn't a newspaper, it was kind of the home. And so when we needed to socialize, it was Grassroots Goombas that provided that outlet for us, everything we did together, and was a growing circle of people, and everybody looked out for each other. In an interesting way, when the state of emergency was declared, those of us who were in prison kind of could look out for each other. We could undertake our political education. However hard it was, we could do things. Many of the people who were outside and always on the run had different kinds of issues. When I look at a period like the state of emergency, for instance, it's less about the repression and the detentions and stuff. For me, it was the way in which people who remained outside and people who were inside and then released actually lost it. I don't even want to go into the number of people who developed deep psychological problems, people who started drinking and embarked on a path of self-destruct. It's those kinds of costs, because suddenly the family that had held everything together is no longer there. But that was what we came through, and then you get into government and you realize. You know, for me, I suppose it was different. Right from the moment, you know, I'd been elected onto the NEC of the ANC 91, July, August, we have the first meeting of the NEC where some of us are asked to join the NWC. we elected onto the NWC, and we look at this and we say, no, we can't leave the Western Cape. Some of us must remain. And then there's a big persuasion about the ANC needing a distribution of geography, race and gender and so on, why it's important. So both Cheryl Carolus and I must up and off and come to Joburg. But just before coming to Joburg, we don't know what we're going to do. I don't have many skills. Bear in mind, I'd worked in engineering, but I'd left that in '81. I was only an organizer now for almost a decade. Cyril Ramaphosa calls me as the SG, and he says, I met the president, the officials met, the president asked me to call you. And, the call is about assigning responsibility, and the responsibility that we've assigned to you is Department of Economic Planning. And I say, Cyril, you've got to be kidding. I know no economics. Isn't there something else I can do? And he says, no. But Ibo was very clear, this is not a negotiation. This is an instruction about what you will do in the ANC. Now, if you feel that you're not equal to the task, feel free to call the president. My job as Secretary General is to tell you what the officials think that you should do. And I hit a complete panic because I don't know any of this stuff. And I then come to Joburg, and it's tough, you're on an ANC salary, you can't bring the family with you, and you look around the department and there are all of these economists. And these are the people who you must lead. And you need to work with them. One of the things I had to do very quickly was to say to those very same people, what do I read? How do I go about things? And so on and so on. And all of them were gracious in helping me understand, and then we could debate, because none of these things are without value judgment, how you take things forward, and within months, we'd run the Ready to Govern conference. Then we were kind of just steaming ahead. And I think that whilst those things were happening, you also had a process of negotiation, and on the economic sections, our department had to produce the work for it. We needed a presence. We needed to meet with business, with trade unions. We needed, and it was already in '92 when the ANC said, now, we need a program that will bring the alliance together, which is where the RDP work was started. And that grew and brought in more and more people, and through '93 we needed to do a number of things. I mean, the travel schedule was crazy because Madiba had to be taken across the world and talk economics. We needed to deal with day-to-day issues. I mean, the country was in drought. How did we pull that out? We needed to build a presence in all of what we then called regions, later provinces in the ANC. We needed views for negotiation. I mean, if you were going to establish 9 provinces, what were they going to be? How was power going to be transferred, especially over budgetary matters? All of the learning that we did in that period, because there isn't any other transition in the world that was as complex as ours. And our learning was vertical, and the only way you could do it was actually to work incredibly hard. And so it was February '93 when the RDP was launched. It became the ANC Manifesto. And while that stuff was happening, we were already out on the streets campaigning for elections. And so you learn to multitask as well. Learn to multitask, take on all of these responsibilities. And before we know it, we're in government. And, you know, when I look back on previous periods, there was nothing in my makeup that had prepared me for public service or going to government. You know, I recall an intense period. There was a list produced, and there was an election result. We had a party. Then we had to go to Parliament. So there's an election result and a party to celebrate an ANC victory. There's a list, and now we're going to Parliament. And on the Friday before we are sworn in, because we must be sworn in to elect Madiba as the president, amongst other things, we have a meeting, and they announce, Madiba says, look, there's going to be a cabinet in the government of national unity. There are some positions that the ANC can secure. I've been meeting Mr. de Klerk, and this is okay. And then he runs through the list, and this is Friday morning, and he says, amongst others, you know, I will become the Minister of Trade and Industry. So we sort of congratulate each other, pat each other on the back. I have to go back to my department because there are two other people in the department who are going to become ministers. One is Tito Mbuweni to become Minister of Labour, Derek Hanekom to become Minister of Land Reform. So congratulations all round. I get called back down and told, you know, the G7 and the Warsaw Pact countries, ministers are meeting today and tomorrow. That's Friday and Saturday in Warsaw, in Poland. Go there so that you can be introduced to these people, because as Minister of Trade and Industry, you're going to have to work with those people. So I say, but I must go to Parliament on Monday. In fact, on Sunday, we're going to be shown what Parliament looks like. I've walked that street every single day from school, and I'd never been inside the place. I don't know this place called Parliament. So Thabo Mbeki says, it's okay. I've checked this thing out. Fly to Frankfurt tonight. There's an early morning flight from Frankfurt to Warsaw. Get there. Meet everybody. You're not going to be able to do much more than meet them towards the end of their meeting. And then Ron Brown, American Commerce Secretary, is coming to the inauguration. He'll give you a lift back. So, I mean, it's the start of madness. So go to Warsaw, meet everybody, hugs, and so on and so on. And then Ron Brown gives me a lift to Joburg, jump onto a flight, go to Cape Town, arrive at lunchtime on Sunday, get shown around Parliament. People get assigned responsibilities. In Parliament, Comrade Stofile, you will be the chief whip, like that. Comrade Trevor, you will be the leader of government business. I don't know. I've never been in government, never been in Parliament. I have no idea how laws work, how laws are made. So to take this responsibility on top of being a Minister of Trade and Industry is like crazy, you know. And then the Monday we're at Parliament, Madiba is elected, he addresses people on parade. Tuesday morning, 4 o'clock, we fly up for the inauguration. We remain behind. There's still negotiation about positions. De Klerk hasn't agreed to minister in the presidency for RDP and so on. All of that stuff's negotiated. Eventually we get sworn in. And then, now nobody tells you anything. So you have to sleep in Pretoria, you don't have any clean clothes, you have nothing, you don't have a toothbrush, you don't know where to go, I mean, it's a crazy kind of situation. We get through that, and then I go off, I get a car, go to the Department of Trade and Industry, I go and see the acting DG, I say to him, all right, I'm going to come here on Monday as your new minister and so on. Begin to take responsibility immediately. The ANC, certainly in DP, was smart, and we'd prepared for all the positions that we could possibly take. And I know in trade and industry, I had two documents, one a thicker one and one a thin one. The thicker one said trade and industry policy in democratic South Africa, and the thin one said the first 100 days in trade and industry. And I had something that I could work with. And that preparation was there. But you know, trade and industry involved many things. It was building a presence in the country. It also meant taking an apartheid economy into the global economy as part of democratization. It meant leading trade missions abroad, receiving trade ministers here because everybody wanted to see this country and have conferences here, building a department where everybody was white, male, and wore grey shoes, transforming all of that, and then building a presence through 9 new provinces with MECs, all of that stuff compacted, and you could only do it if you tried to lead by example. And the only example that I knew was one that said that we were not only working hard, we were working smart, and we would think ahead. And it's in those circumstances, the challenge of that, where you learn, never go into a meeting and chair a meeting that you don't know what the outcome is going to be. Think about these issues, create participation as you have to. But you've got to think through conclusions. You can't just meet for the sake of it.
Many of your economic policy detractors says that you were part of the class of 96. Were you a member of the class of 96, and what is the class of 96?
Okay, I think that the objectives were very different. The first set of objectives in trade and industry was you've got to build businesses that can create employment. Part of it was also to understand that taking our country into the global economy meant dealing with some tough issues domestically, and one of the examples was the automobile sector. Autos in South Africa had a tariff wall of 125%. So if you wanted to import a car, you added 125% to the import price, and on that basis you could produce anything at any cost without any concerns for productivity. And we knew it couldn't happen. We knew that we needed to expand the sector. But one of the ways of doing it was actually to drop the tariff. And we worked, and fortunately NUMSA then was more open to ideas, and they had some Australian influence, and amongst those Australian trade unionists were people who had lived through the auto sector meltdown in Australia, and could advise NUMSA as their advisors, not as advisors to the ANC or government. And we were able to reach an agreement, and I remember the first tariff cut from 125 to 75, so it was a big cut, happened on a Friday, it was gazetted on the Friday. The Sunday morning I opened the Sunday Times, NUMSA's on strike. And the journalist has written that it's because of the tariff decrease. And we didn't have cell phones, but I had Enoch Godongwana's number. He was the general secretary. I called him. He laughed at me. He said, no, there's nothing to do with you. It's a wage issue. On the tariffs, we agreed. And so with some unions, it was like okay to deal with that with some unions, and one that was very near to my own heart because my first job was in a clothing factory. It was clothing and textiles, where the big battle to build a clothing sector meant that we had to be a little less protective about the tariffs, and it wasn't an issue that was resolved then. It's still not resolved now. How do you build a viable, growing textile industry that employs people? But the big issue was that we would unfold an industrial policy. An industrial policy is interesting because it's not just what government says. It's what employers say, what prospective investors say, what trade unions say. And you've got to work across the board at getting these things right. And we'd started a process along those lines. We also started then a focus on small business. The first presidential small business conference was held in Durban in about August of '95. We knew that we wanted to build small business and bring black people into business. We knew that we needed industrial policy and we needed trade policy. And we needed institutions to support it, like the IDC and so on. And that work was underway, and I moved over with effect from early April of '96. So I didn't even have 2 years to see through some of those things. But in many ways, you know, I think that economic development would be about the microeconomic reforms. That's where jobs are, that's where wealth is created. Macro only creates a big environment, but it's the micro issues. And I think that as a government, since '94, we've actually been particularly weak at the microeconomic stuff. When I was introduced to the team in trade and industry, in finance, already then it was clear that we were in a lot of trouble. The macroeconomy was wounded because it was isolated for so long. We had no reserves in the Reserve Bank. In fact, we had negative reserves. The deficit was pretty high because the deficit that we inherited was 9.2%, and to service a deficit like that would have meant that debt service costs build up the biggest part of, or take up the biggest part of what you have. We didn't have a credit rating yet. So before I became minister in towards the end of '94, a team went with Goldman Sachs to raise money in a global bond. The rates that they borrowed at were actually at junk market states. So, you know, all of those things had to be taken on and dealt with differently. And amongst the issues was how we stabilized our macroeconomy. I remember having a discussion with the leadership, and I'm now trying to understand these things in a lot more detail, and trying to explain this to the officials of the ANC. And Madiba says, but what is wrong with what we're doing? And I say, look, our deficit is too high, and you've borrowed money, we've borrowed too much money, and we're going to pay a price because servicing that debt is going to be very expensive. I say, for me, the big concern is that by 1997, debt service costs would be the biggest number in our budget. He says, bigger even than education. I say, yes, bigger even than education. He says, That can't be right. So who do we owe the money to? Is it Harry Oppenheimer and Anton Rupert? Because I can phone them and say. So we then explain that the problem is the bond market draws on pension funds. So it's pension funds of workers that are invested in this deficit. And if we don't pay, then you wipe out the pensions of working people. He says, no, we must never do that. So how do we do this then? We explain that amongst the things is we've got to try and cut the deficit. And there's a discussion, and other economists are drawn in, and we then agree that there's a broad package like this. And we're mandated to continue. And as this program is starting to take shape, we say we're not going to the IMF. We fought very hard for our sovereignty. We're not going to give it away. So let's try and agree on a package. So he invites some of the leadership, but also people from COSATU and the Communist Party to his house on a Sunday, and we talk through the issue, and we say, look, we're still trying to firm the numbers up because we don't have them yet. This is not something off the shelf. We're trying to give effect to exactly what it will entail. But this is a request for political support. And there then is an agreement that we'll table this thing on the 14th of June of 96. We'll table it in Parliament, and then we'll work at trying to deal with this matter. And one of the first, the Deputy President Thabo Mbeki spoke, and then I delivered this in Parliament, and then from the ANC whips, it was Naledi Pandor who spoke. And one of the early speakers in that debate was Philip Dexter, who was then the treasurer of the SACP. And
Communist Party.
Yes, he explained that the Communist Party would have wanted this to be different, but if we could deal with the deficit differently, they'd be happier, but they can support it. You can go and check. Anybody must feel free to check the Hansard on this, because these things don't lie. This is not my memory. The Hansard of Parliament, 14th June 96, will tell you what Philip Dexter said. On the same day, the General Secretary of COSATU, he was then still called Sam Shilowa, was out of the country, and his deputy who was acting was a man called Zwelinzima Mavavi, who issued a statement saying we didn't get everything that we want, but it's not too bad. That statement is available on certainly on the independent online website. You'll also find it in COSATU, and you'll find it also published in the Communist University. What those statements reflect is that there'd been some discussion. It lacked detail, but there'd been some discussion. If you look at this issue later, there were other interests that came into play. And so when people couldn't resolve these contradictions, people in the Communist Party described this as the 96 class project. Not in 96, but much, much later. It was just a label that they gave to stuff. I mean, when they didn't like what Thabo Mbeki did, they described it as the Zanification of politics in South Africa. I don't know whether they would replace the Zanification with the Zumification. But I've never actually been affected by little labels that people give. The key issue for me is to understand that part of taking responsibility as being in cabinet entails is about the ability to take decisions. The ability to take decisions, you must always understand, will not be in conditions of your own making. If you only want to take decisions in fair weather, you'll never make it as a leader. It's that ability to understand that even on difficult issues, if you've embarked on an attempt at explaining and persuading, and there are still disagreements, you can't hold off this thing. I promise you that if we had wavered on gear in '96 and pretended that you could negotiate this, because ultimately governments must take responsibility. You see, as Minister Nene now prepares for the budget, he's got to be resolute about what he needs to deliver on. If you bring in the trade unions, they turn it into wage bargaining. If the minister tries to reduce the deficit, say, to 4%, they will start with 12% and hope that they get 8%. But you can't run macroeconomic policy on that basis. You can't run interest rates on that basis. What you need is to recognize that macroeconomic policy decisions always have large technical considerations. But in dealing with those technical considerations, you must afford an opportunity to debate, not negotiate, to dialogue on them. But you're not going to achieve anything unless you also have trust. And political trust is very important. And part of the situation is that in the last while, trust has broken down very badly.
Many of your contemporaries, in particular former President Kgalema Motlanthe, speaks about the tension between the individual and the collective. Have you faced that in the portfolio of being a minister over the last period?
It always is there.
How do you navigate those?
I think that it needs a lot of courage and confidence, and I think that the ability to go back and say and know a couple of issues. A, that the technical ground you're standing on is firm. I've always believed that we should try and employ people in key positions who know a lot more, because there's an assurance in that. The second issue is technicians. Public servants are technicians. They should not be required to understand the political fit of a decision. That's the minister's responsibility. The minister will do it with them, ask the tough questions, develop the perspective, and it's the minister's responsibility to persuade the political organization of that. The third dimension of this is that it's always hard to be a finance minister. You ask people, if you went to people now in senior levels of government and you ask them, they may frequently still express a view that the problem is the Treasury. Now, what we tried to do to de-emphasize the individual was to develop a system. Our system on the budget, and the budget is very tense. At the conclusion of the budget, before you take it to Parliament, there's a cabinet discussion. And when you get to that cabinet discussion, there will always be one or a few ministers who say, I feel hard done by, I need more money. And I think that we've been privileged to have some heads of state who would say, that's an interesting perspective. You have to accept the size of the cake is what we have. We agreed 5 months ago that the deficit will be this. So we've only got so many billions to spend. Some parts of it are agreed to. You've got to give the provinces so much money. What we have as national is so much. You're saying that you don't have it. How much more would you like? Frequently there might be a sort of murmuring of, yes, maybe 10%. All right. All right? Ministers, we're not going to take this decision now. We're going to come back later. We're going to give this minister an opportunity to consider where to take that 10% from, because it can't come from the air. It has to come from the rest of your budget. Inevitably, you close the discussion right there and then. But you need a head of state who's confident, who trusts the process. You see, amongst the process issues that we ran, to de-individualize, we ran something called the Ministers' Committee on the Budget. It was a big spending department and some technical ministers, and we would debate what the issues are. But if the Minister of Education as a big spender is there, she can't talk her own book. She can't say for education. She has to apply her mind in the same way as the Minister of Finance would. And what that did was to establish a collective, which was very important. But the other thing that it did was to say that this was considered by more than one individual. Inevitably, though, when the chips are down, it's the Minister of Finance who must take that responsibility. You've got to live by the decisions that you lead people to take, and I think that is the same regardless of what you do, whether it's in a situation of war, or in living out executive responsibility.
My last question is that two of your colleagues that served with you in cabinet had a particular view on the last days, the last 8 days of President Thabo Mbeki's period. You always said that I serve at the pleasure of the president. And at the time of that break of Thabo Mbeki being recalled, you decided to resign. Could you explain to us what was the rationale and why did you choose to take that option?
Okay. You know, we had hoped. It was clear that there was a big break coming. Julius Malema was already saying to the press, are we going to fire Thabo Mbeki and so on, even though he wasn't in cabinet or anything like that. And there were tensions around the judgment by Judge Nicholson. We debated the issue, and it was clear that there was no go forward on it. And there then was a decision. I disagreed with the decision to try and appeal against Nicholson's judgment, and my view of that, and would still be a view of other circumstances today. Political problems need political solutions. Interpretations of the law need judges involved. If you empower the courts to take political decisions, you disempower the body politic. For me, that's trite. And with some of my colleagues, even in cabinet then, I had a disagreement on this point, but you know, it's just in the nature of debate that you don't always agree on matters. We tried to, some of us who were both members of cabinet and the NEC, tried to persuade the officials of the ANC not to take a decision on that fateful Friday in September of 2008 to recall. And we thought that we'd persuaded the leadership to accept a position that you would not take something as drastic as recall, but would have an early election. But the debate, I thought the debate was calming and became very fierce in the evening, and eventually at about 2:30 in the morning it was agreed to recall Thabo Mbeki. I was not there at the time, but I was bound by the decision, and I called my staff.
Decision of the collective.
It's a cabinet, it's an NEC decision. I called my staff, my chief of staff, my PA, to my office, and they wrote a letter on a letterhead of the Ministry of Finance, saying that I serve at the pleasure of the President and I resign. It wasn't a fit of pique or anything. It's perfectly rational in the way in which my system works. By 8 o'clock in the morning, I delivered the letter to Thabo Mbeki. And then I went to the NEC meeting. And I gave a copy to Jacob Zuma, and I gave a copy to Kgalema Motlanthe, who would be the incoming president. And they said, no, you took the wrong decision. I said, this is the only decision that's viable. And I explained it to them in this way. I said, to become a member of the NEC of the ANC, once I'm nominated, I receive a nomination form, I sign it, and I say that I avail myself for election. If I'm elected, then the ANC is fully entitled to give me responsibilities. When I want to go to Parliament, there's a nomination form. I sign the nomination form. I become a member of Parliament. Nobody asks for my permission because I'm not nominated into a cabinet position. The President sits down with the officials of the ANC and says, I'd like the following people to serve. In law, that is called the pleasure of the President. You've taken the President out of play, so there's no pleasure anymore. A new President must be able to exercise his or her pleasure. Shouldn't be held by previous decisions. Now, Kgalema knew that he'd sort of fill the gap. And we had the discussion, and he said, no, but you're wrong. Because the President didn't only make the call. Remember, I was there when you were assigned. I said, and I was there as Secretary General. No, sorry. He was there. Yes, he was there as Secretary General of the ANC still. I said, yes, I'm aware of that. But it's still the pleasure of the President. In constitutional law, the party doesn't come into it. He said, but this is going to create havoc. I said to him, you know, Mkhuluwa, what'll happen is you must avoid a factional fallout. I'm saying I've resigned. I'm not withdrawing it. I've resigned. If you asked me whether I would serve, and you came along with Gwede and asked me, or however you did it, I can give you a guarantee that I will serve. Because you are exercising pleasure. And that pleasure is the responsibility to convene a cabinet. And I wasn't able to persuade them of this view. And I wasn't being silly about it. I just think that it's the correct thing. I think that what doesn't happen in this country is when people do wrong, they don't want to get out of the way. Whereas, you know, what good governance is about in my mind is it's about building sound institutions. Government in broad must be a sound institution. The Treasury where I work must be a sound institution. It must bring people through. It must be able to replicate skills. It must have a voice. That is what a sound institution does. But sound institutions also need sound leadership. And these two things always go together. It doesn't matter how good a leader you are, if you don't have an institution that you can fall back on, that can hold you to account, you can't have good governance. And so, you know, I think that by recognizing the pleasure of the president, it became for me a very important issue. So I wasn't playing silly buggers. I wasn't saying, you know, I'm not going to serve because I'm Thabo Mbeki's man. I was trying to make a point that I'm not factionally involved. The same thing happened later. I mean, you know, there was a big fallout, of course, because I was in the States. I left that same Saturday, and I was traveling between New York and Washington when the news broke that my letter was leaked and that Anne fell out of bed, and I had to have a press conference from DC to talk to people about this issue, to indicate that I've already said to the person who wasn't president yet, Motlanthe, if he needed me to serve, then I would serve. It's not a factional issue. Later, subsequently, in 2009, I said to Jacob Zuma, as ANC president, I'm not available to serve anymore. Here is my nomination form. I haven't signed it yet to go back to Parliament. And he said to me, no, we need you. And I said, but the Rand fell out of bed when I resigned. There's too much of a conflation between the individual and the portfolio. That's wrong in any society. You can't have that. It weakens democracy. And he said, okay, but I have something else for you to do, not Minister of Finance. Don't ask me what it is because I want to be fair to everybody. And I then agreed that I would go back, but it would be for one term maximum. So I've tried to take the secrecy out of it, and to recognize that there's actually some rational basis to the idea of the pleasure of the president, you know, I'd like to believe that we must not be factional in our conduct.
Do you know about the triple T's? Thabo Mbeki, Trevor Manual, and Tito Mboweni. The connection between the Union Buildings, Church Square, and the Reserve Bank.
Well, you know, it just happened. I don't think that these things are preordained. I think that for a whole host of reasons we could sit down. It wasn't always plain sailing. There were issues that were very tough between us. Especially Tito and I, two bulls in a crawl. You know, all of that stuff played out. And in many ways, I suppose, you see, Thabo Mbeki was a calming influence. If there were tensions, he would call us and we could talk, and he likes talking till 3, 4 in the morning, you know, until you've resolved a position. And that was a phenomenally important asset in building a team, in building esprit de corps, even if in your heart of hearts you didn't always agree on matters. And there were tough issues, you know. In 2007, our analysis in the Treasury was there's going to be a global recession. There's going to be a perfect storm coming. We need to build a cushion, and so part of the cushion is in a fiscal surplus. Man, it was possibly the toughest debate I had, because everybody seems to believe in big surpluses, in big deficits. Now you're talking surplus. It was politically very, very, very difficult. And again, it was one of those issues where we could meet at night and talk till 3 in the morning and reach agreement on issues. That was always there, you know. The joy of knowing that you can go with tough decisions and get air cover from your head of state, I think was one of the rare privileges that I had.